We sometimes imagine that when Moses is speaking to the people, he is speaking to a neutral crowd, of people who are not necessarily against and not necessarily for, or if they had to decide, hopefully for, what he has to say. And it's a reminder that that's not really the case. The people that Moses are speaking to today are dealing with the generational folly of the people who came before them, and this is always the question. How is it that each generation can renew the promises, especially if the generation that came before really messed things up? And this is a question that we ask not just in churches, but we ask in society and social organizations. Not even what happens if people didn't mess things up, but how do we make sure that generationally this thing's going to keep going? It's one reason why we do faith formation. It's a question that we ask in American society. How will each generation renew the compact we have with one another, for example? But Moses is working uphill this morning, because you'll remember that the day he came down with the Ten Commandments, the people were worshiping the golden calf, and they set back an entire generation. So these are the kids of people who lived through an incredible mistake. And the reason we even have the book of Deuteronomy, which means the second telling of the law, the reason Moses has to give them the law a second time is to lay out again the spiritual topography of what's at stake. I set before you two things, life and prosperity, death and adversity. The stakes are high. Moses doesn't just say, I'm setting before you a possible strategy that will improve your life, help you sleep at night and maybe make a little bit more money. He doesn't talk in those ways. He says, life and prosperity, death and adversity. And you will get to choose which way you walk. Now, with life and prosperity, we realize that when God called the people out of slavery in Egypt, he reminded them they were not meant to be slaves. They were not meant to be subjugated. They were not meant to merely be the mindless labor of Pharaoh's empire. They were made for something more, including communion with God. And yet that communion with God is not formless. That communion with God has a pretty clear outline. Hence all the laws and the rules. God says for us really to prosper, these are the parameters of prosperity, the parameters of a kind of self-governing, the parameters of belonging to me. And you always have another choice, which is to bow the knee to other gods, and when you turn your heart, you will lose your sense of hearing. So sometimes when we go, well, I can't hear God, or I can't sense anything God is saying, sometimes it's because our heart's pointed in the wrong direction. You know, it's like when someone's talking into the wind. We need to be downwind from the sound, so to speak. And so that is the alternative that people imagine to secure a prosperous and happy life. They will be responsible for charting that course on their own, finding the right God, securing the right possessions, and saying, well, I did my best, and even if we all didn't get there, I got there the best I could. And it becomes a kind of individualistic competition, competing over resources. This is why every apocalyptic drama is a kind of Mad Max, Walking Dead, zombie drama of people walking around with rifles trying to take things from each other, whether it's gasoline or food or weaponry, saying we've reduced ourselves to a kind of tribal belonging because that's all we got. And God is calling the people to something greater than that. Now we know that as Christians, the way that God has solved the problem of wandering hearts, the way God has solved the problem of choosing the wrong gods, going spiritually deaf and the like, is he sent us one faithful person named Jesus of Nazareth, who could in fact enact that communion when we could not. Because to be honest, even when we want to choose life and prosperity, we are too easily seduced and tempted by alternate voices or alternate proposals of security, especially when we're afraid. And so Jesus becomes the faithful partner in the covenant that allows us to participate in God's prosperous life. And we might say, oh, what a relief. It means we can do whatever we want. And then you hear the gospel this morning, and Jesus says, oh, it's not like that. You're going to have to hate. And we go, well, I thought Christianity was about love. What does he mean we have to hate? Especially because the word hate in our time takes on a criminal aspect. And of course, the word that Jesus is using doesn't mean hate in the way we use it. He just means make sure that you love God first. That's what he means by hate. So he doesn't say, all right, everyone, well, I went to church today, and you go home to your family and say, I hate all of you. I'm finally confirmed I hate all of you. He doesn't mean that. He means calibrate your love, your relationship to other people, and your relationship to your possessions according to your primary commitment to God. That's what he means. That's why in Lutheran Catechism, when we teach about the commandments from the Ten Commandments about coveting, one of them applies to your neighbor's possessions, one of them applies to your neighbor's people. So it's both of those aspects, making sure that we have right relationship with our neighbor's possessions and our neighbor's people, so we don't find our love being disordered or disoriented. This is one of the great definitions of sin, which is merely misapplied love. This is why sin is so seductive, because you go, well, how can it be wrong? I really love doing it. And you go, well, the problem is you're loving this more than God. And so we need to recalibrate our love. And indeed, that is a kind of dying, because it's a dying to our own self-determination that our desires and our plans are the best plans. And that's why Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. Now, it's interesting because Jesus doesn't just mean, well, think about it once. Notice that he wants you to engage it like a builder. He wants you to think about your life as a kind of lifelong architectural project. And he goes, if you're really serious about this, consider what it's going to take to get there. That's why he uses the image of planning. And then he uses the image of an army. If you have 10,000, do you really want to go fight someone that has 20,000? Maybe you should sue for peace. And Jesus is basically telling us that if we're going to take our meager plans, our disordered love, and our special affection for our possessions and try and leverage them against God, good luck in that. It's more important that you would sue for peace and say, you know what, I don't know if this is going to get me where I want to go. I need you to get me there. And maybe I want to switch sides and be in your army and be at your command, rather than with my own sort of meager project of attempted immortality on my own. And of course, this is why Jesus includes possessions as a postscript, because we are so tempted to secure some kind of freedom from danger and anxiety through the accumulation of things that it becomes a kind of cholesterol for the heart, the spiritual heart, and not good cholesterol. The bad cholesterol, whichever one that is. I can never remember when I get my cholesterol. Are these numbers good or bad? I can't remember which one this is. So then I just ignore them. That seems to have worked so far. No, the doctor didn't like that when I said that. But it becomes a kind of hardening of the heart. It becomes a kind of trusting in the wrong thing. It becomes a kind of idolatry. We think of idolatry as a primitive problem, but it's not. It's taking things that don't give life and acting like they do. And whether it's a little statue in the tent of Abraham, or whether it's a car or a house or an investment or whatever, it is easy for us to put our trust in the wrong things and not to realize that we are courting not prosperity, at the least adversity, and maybe at the end a kind of dying and death. And it's interesting that Jesus actually proposes that the way to life and prosperity is exactly through a kind of dying, which is the cross. So Jesus reconciles these in his own message. Now, just for a little bit of a fun bonus, what happens when your possession happens to also be a person? And that's the second reading that Jean read to us. It's one of the shortest books in the Bible, so if you have a short attention span, you should read the book of Philemon. It is a book that commends itself to you. And Onesimus, whose name means useful, was a slave. That's why that Paul does a little play on words when he goes, he's no longer useful to you. He's saying he's no longer Onesimus to you. He's now your brother in Christ. What happens when the work of Jesus fundamentally alters reality so it changes our relationship to those things that have great value that we love? And in this case, it's a person's slave, a person's property that happens to be another person. And Paul, in a very short letter, says, now I could, if I wanted, remind you that you wouldn't be a Christian without me, but I'm not going to do that. That seems in bad taste, to remind you of that. So I will simply command you. What does it mean that Onesimus is now your brother? And I hope you do the right thing. I know you'll do the right thing. Do the right thing. You know, Paul can be very persuasive that way. Oh, I'm just an old man and he's my son. You know what you have to do. But this is a perfect example. If you think about this story of Philemon and his slave Onesimus, it is the perfect example of a person who has prospered in the world as it is, who is now confronted with the world as it will be. And he now has to recalibrate all of his arrangements with himself, other people, and his possessions according to the news of the gospel. And this might be an important part of this sitting down and planning that Jesus talks about, is to really ask yourself, how does my relationship with Christ change my relationship with other people and my possessions? And in what way is God primary, and in what way is God not primary? Where do we see prosperity? Where do we see adversity? That's why God puts that choice before Deuteronomy, and that's why Jesus says, take up your cross. It is going to cost us everything to receive everything, but you're going to get more than everything. You're going to get God himself and everything that comes with that kingdom. And all the things that we thought we were going to get by cobbling together our little plans will evaporate in the face of this great gift. But it's also through this recalibrating that in fact we have the spiritual resources to renew the generations, to say it is possible that one generation can live into the next, that there can be prosperity and not fearfulness and sadness and concern, that there can be hope in life, not because of our scheming, but because of how good God is and what God has done. And by that light and by that grace, having ourselves rearranged according to God's own heart for the sake of life and prosperity in the world. Amen.